In the small, quiet town of Sissonville, West Virginia, a shocking case of child abuse sent ripples through the nation. Jeanne Whitefeather and Donald Lantz, a seemingly ordinary couple, had managed to hide a horrifying reality behind the walls of their rural home. Their crimes, forced labor, severe neglect, and relentless physical and psychological abuse, would ultimately lead to one of the most disturbing child abuse cases in recent history. This story is not just about two individuals who committed unimaginable acts against children they had sworn to protect. It is also about the vigilance of a community, the resilience of the victims, and the justice that finally prevailed. The case drew widespread media attention, not only for its brutality but also for its racial undertones. Whitefeather and Lantz, both white, had adopted 5 black children, who they treated not as family members but as prisoners and laborers. Understanding this case is crucial in shedding light on the horrors of child abuse and neglect, the failures of the system that allowed it to happen, and the importance of intervention when signs of mistreatment appear. It serves as a grim reminder of the responsibility society holds in protecting its most vulnerable members. As we unravel the details of this case, we will examine how Jeanne Whitefeather and Donald Lantz adopted these children, how their treatment worsened over time, and how their crimes were eventually exposed. More importantly, we will look at the aftermath, the legal consequences, the children's journey toward healing, and what we, as a society, can do to prevent such cases in the future. The story of Jeanne Whitefeather and Donald Lantz begins years before their crimes were discovered. To the outside world, they appeared to be a generous couple who had opened their home to 5 adopted children. But behind closed doors, their home was anything but a place of love and safety. In 2018, while living in Minnesota, Whitefeather and Lantz adopted 5 black siblings, ranging in age from 5 to 16. The children came from difficult backgrounds, having experienced instability in their biological home. The adoption should have been an opportunity for them to start anew, to experience a stable, nurturing family environment. Instead, it marked the beginning of years of abuse, neglect, and suffering. Not long after the adoption, the family moved to Washington state, settling on a farm. This move provided them with the isolation they desired, far from the watchful eyes of neighbors or child welfare authorities. It was here that the first signs of mistreatment began to emerge. Neighbors in Washington recalled seeing the children working excessively on the farm. Unlike typical chores assigned to children as a part of their upbringing, these tasks were harsh, physically demanding, and relentless. Witnesses would later testify that the children were rarely seen playing, laughing, or interacting as normal siblings would. Instead, they were made to stand in line for hours, carry heavy objects up hills, and perform grueling tasks in the fields. But the true horror of their situation was not yet widely known. To outsiders, it may have seemed like strict parenting or a family embracing a hardworking rural lifestyle. However, as time passed, the control Whitefeather and Lantz exerted over the children deepened. In 2023, the couple made another move, this time to a remote property in West Virginia. The isolation of their new home would allow the abuse to escalate to unimaginable levels, turning the children's lives into a waking nightmare. Please subscribe to my channel, and I will bring you more videos featuring the most shocking true crime stories. In May 2023, Jeanne Whitefeather and Donald Lantz relocated their family to a remote property in Sissonville, West Virginia. The move was not just a change of scenery, it was a deliberate attempt to isolate the children further, ensuring that their abuse could continue without interference. West Virginia's rural landscape provided the couple with the seclusion they sought. Their new home, far from major cities and surrounded by vast stretches of land, became a prison for the 5 children they had adopted. Unlike in Washington, where neighbors had occasionally seen signs of forced labor and control, this new environment made it even easier to hide the mistreatment. One of the first red flags for those living nearby was the children's absence. While new families typically integrate into a community, these children were rarely seen. When they did appear, they were often engaged in exhausting labor, carrying heavy supplies across the property under the watchful eyes of Lantz. Neighbors soon started to notice disturbing patterns. The children never played outside. They never rode bikes, talked freely, or showed any signs of a normal childhood. Instead, they worked tirelessly, hauling fencing, carrying water buckets, and performing other physically demanding chores. Those who saw them described a sense of unease, as if the children were under strict, unrelenting control. More alarmingly, the children never spoke to each other in public. They moved in silence, following orders with mechanical obedience. This eerie quietness, combined with their withdrawn and fearful expressions, hinted at something far more sinister than strict parenting. Inside the home, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Whitefeather and Lantz imposed harsh punishments on the children, using isolation and deprivation as tools of control. Those who disobeyed or failed to complete their assigned tasks were subjected to cruel forms of discipline, including extended periods of confinement in a shed. By the fall of 2023, the situation had escalated beyond anything the children had previously endured. They were not only forced to work but were now being completely cut off from the outside world, locked away for hours or even days at a time in inhumane conditions. It was only a matter of time before someone spoke up. And when they did, the truth about the horrors unfolding inside the Whitefeather Lantz household would finally come to light. As the months passed in their new home in West Virginia, the abuse inflicted by Jeanne Whitefeather and Donald Lantz escalated to unbearable levels. The 5 adopted children were no longer just subjected to excessive labor, they were treated as prisoners in their own home, enduring conditions that defied human decency. One of the most disturbing aspects of their mistreatment was the extreme punishment system the couple implemented. If a child disobeyed, showed resistance, or failed to complete a task to Whitefeather and Lantz's satisfaction, they were locked inside a shed, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. The shed had no running water, no toilet, and no insulation against the elements. The children were given nothing more than a thin blanket to sleep on the cold concrete floor. Food was weaponized as a means of control. Meals were scarce, often limited to peanut butter sandwiches, sometimes left over from previous meals. Hunger became a daily struggle, and the children were forced to endure long hours of physical labor on empty stomachs. When they were given water, it was often warm and rationed. Hygiene was completely neglected. When authorities eventually found the children, they were wearing filthy clothes, their bodies covered in dirt and sores. One of the boys, who had been forced to work barefoot for extended periods, had open wounds on his feet. The children had not been bathed regularly, their hair was matted, and their bodies smelled of prolonged neglect. But the physical abuse was only one part of their suffering. Whitefeather, in particular, used psychological torment to break the children's spirits. Witnesses later testified that she frequently used insults when addressing the children, reinforcing a dynamic of power and degradation. Some children were forced to stand for hours in their bedrooms with their hands on their heads, deprived of sleep and rest. Others were made to perform tasks that had no real purpose, such as repeatedly carrying buckets of water up and down a hill, simply to exhaust them and assert control. Security cameras installed inside the home captured much of the cruelty. The footage showed children standing motionless for long periods, visibly weak and exhausted. These recordings would later serve as key evidence in court, proving the extent of the abuse. Neighbors who had witnessed glimpses of the children's suffering grew increasingly concerned. Though they didn't yet know the full extent of the horrors unfolding behind closed doors, the warning signs were undeniable. Finally, someone took action. A call was made to authorities, reporting the suspected abuse. Law enforcement would soon arrive at the Whitefeather Lantz property, uncovering a nightmare far worse than anyone had imagined. On a quiet evening in October 2023, deputies from the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office arrived at the rural property in Sissonville, West Virginia. They had received a troubling report from concerned neighbors: children were being mistreated, locked away, and subjected to forced labor. What the officers found when they entered the property would confirm their worst fears. The first signs of distress were evident before they even stepped inside. The property, surrounded by farmland, seemed desolate, with no visible signs of children playing or engaging in normal activities. The home itself was eerily silent. Deputies knocked on the door, but no one answered. Acting on the report, the officers searched the area and came across a small outbuilding. They knocked again. This time, a faint sound came from inside. A teenage girl's voice responded, but she hesitated. When asked to open the door, she admitted that she didn't have the key. Realizing the urgency of the situation, one of the deputies used a crowbar to force the door open. Inside, they found two children, a 16-year-old girl and a 14-year-old boy, trapped in a tiny room. The conditions were inhumane. There was no running water, no proper toilet, and no bedding. A small portable toilet sat in the corner, filthy and unclean. The floor was hard concrete, and the only available covering was a thin, worn-out blanket. The children were visibly malnourished. Their clothes were dirty, their hair unwashed, and their bodies smelled of prolonged neglect. The 14-year-old boy, who had been forced to walk barefoot for extended periods, had open sores on his feet. The children later told authorities that they had not eaten since early that morning, over 12 hours earlier, and that they had spent most of the day locked in the shed. Inside the main residence, deputies made more horrifying discoveries. A 9-year-old girl was found alone in a loft, crying. She had no safety railing protecting her from falling. The home itself was cluttered and unkempt, with no signs of proper care for the children. Not long after, Donald Lantz returned to the property with another child. When questioned, he showed little concern for the situation. He insisted that the children were simply being disciplined and that their living conditions were appropriate for farm life. Shortly after, Jeanne Whitefeather arrived, but her reaction was no different. She downplayed the abuse, claiming that they were strict parents and that the children needed structure. However, the officers had seen enough. The couple was immediately arrested and taken into custody. As the investigation progressed, even more damning evidence surfaced. Security camera footage from inside the home revealed the brutal punishments the children had endured. The recordings showed them standing for hours with their hands on their heads, visibly exhausted. Neighbors also came forward, testifying that they had seen the children performing grueling labor and being locked inside the shed for extended periods. In May 2024, a grand jury indicted Whitefeather and Lantz on multiple charges, including human trafficking of a minor, forced labor, child abuse, and neglect. The legal process that followed would expose the full extent of their crimes and finally bring justice for the children who had suffered in silence for so long. As the trial of Jeanne Whitefeather and Donald Lantz began in January 2024, the courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and members of the public who had followed the disturbing case. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out the horrifying details of the abuse. The couple faced multiple charges, including human trafficking, forced labor, child neglect, and civil rights violations. Prosecutors argued that Whitefeather and Lantz had not only physically and emotionally abused the children but had done so with deliberate cruelty, stripping them of their dignity and basic human rights. The evidence was overwhelming. Video footage from the couple's home security cameras played a crucial role in proving their guilt. The recordings showed the children standing for hours with their hands on their heads, visibly exhausted and swaying from fatigue. Other footage captured Whitefeather berating the children, using racial slurs and insults to demean them. Witness testimony also painted a grim picture. 3 of the children, now 18, 13, and 10, testified in court, recounting the years of torment they had endured. The oldest child, now an adult, bravely took the stand and directly addressed her abusers. She spoke about the constant hunger, the freezing nights on the concrete floor, and the feeling of being treated like property rather than a person. At one point, she looked Whitefeather in the eye and said, "I will never understand how you can sleep at night. You are a monster." Neighbors also testified, describing the disturbing scenes they had witnessed, children hauling heavy objects in silence, never smiling, never playing. One neighbor broke down in tears as she recalled seeing the children carrying propane tanks and fencing materials, struggling under the weight as Lantz stood by, offering no help. Medical experts provided further damning evidence. Doctors who examined the children after their rescue confirmed signs of chronic malnutrition, untreated infections, and severe psychological trauma. One forensic psychologist testified that the children had exhibited symptoms of severe PTSD, a condition often seen in survivors of extreme abuse. The defense attempted to justify the couple's actions, arguing that Whitefeather and Lantz were overwhelmed by the children's behavioral issues. They claimed that the children had suffered past trauma in their biological home and that the adoptive parents were simply using strict parenting to instill discipline. Whitefeather's lawyer, Mark Plants, insisted that the shed where two children were found was merely a teenage clubhouse and that the couple had never intended to harm them. Lantz's attorney went a step further, blaming the state's child welfare system, claiming that the couple had repeatedly asked for help but had been ignored. However, these arguments fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. Prosecutors pointed out that Whitefeather and Lantz had never sought professional help for the children, despite living near mental health facilities. Instead, they had isolated them, punished them excessively, and treated them as laborers rather than as sons and daughters. After weeks of emotional testimony, the jury reached a swift and unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. On the day of sentencing, the Kanawha County courtroom was filled with a tense silence. Survivors of the abuse sat in the audience, alongside prosecutors, law enforcement officers, and concerned citizens who had followed the case closely. The trial had revealed every horrifying detail of Jeanne Whitefeather and Donald Lantz's crimes, and now, it was time for justice. Judge Mary Claire Akers did not hold back in her condemnation of the couple. Before delivering the sentences, she addressed Whitefeather and Lantz directly. Her voice was firm as she spoke the words that would later be echoed in headlines across the country. You brought these children to West Virginia, a place that I know as almost heaven, and you put them in hell. This court will now put you in yours. May God have mercy on your souls, because this court will not. Then came the sentencing. Jeanne Whitefeather was sentenced to 215 years in prison. Donald Lantz received 160 years. Both sentences were to be served consecutively, ensuring that neither Whitefeather nor Lantz would ever walk free again. Whitefeather would be eligible for parole only after serving 49 years, while Lantz would have to serve at least 36 years before any possibility of early release. The couple was also ordered to pay $280,000 in restitution to the children, money intended to help cover long-term therapy, medical care, and recovery from the trauma they had endured. One of the most powerful moments of the sentencing hearing came when the victims themselves were given a chance to speak. The oldest child, now 18, stood before the court and faced the woman who had abused her for years. "I will never understand how you can sleep at night," she said, her voice steady. "You are a monster." Another child, now living with a new family, had her letter read aloud in court. "I was taught to laugh at my siblings and told they were bad. Now in my new home, I see that everything was not right there. Parents should love their children. You didn't." A third child wrote, "I will be something amazing. I will be strong and beautiful. You will always be exactly what you are, horrible." Their words silenced the courtroom, a heartbreaking but powerful reminder of the strength these children had shown in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The sentencing was widely praised by legal experts, child advocates, and the general public. Many saw it as a landmark case in the fight against child abuse and human trafficking. The severity of the punishment sent a clear message: those who exploit and torture children will face the full force of the law. Madison Tuck, the assistant prosecutor who had led the case, spoke outside the courthouse after the sentencing. "These children are strong, smart, and resilient. They will go on to do amazing things in this world." Today, justice was served. The judge's words, the victim's bravery, and the historic sentencing marked the end of Whitefeather and Lantz's reign of terror. But for the children, the journey to healing was just beginning. With Jeanne Whitefeather and Donald Lantz behind bars, the 5 children they once tormented were finally free, but freedom did not erase the scars left by years of abuse. Their recovery would be a long and difficult journey, shaped by both the trauma they endured and the resilience they had developed to survive it. In the months following the couple's arrest, the children were placed under the care of Child Protective Services, CPS. Social workers and therapists worked closely with them, addressing the severe physical and emotional damage caused by years of neglect and mistreatment. Mental health professionals diagnosed several of the children with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety, and depression, all common in survivors of extreme abuse. Some struggled with nightmares, fear of authority figures, and difficulty trusting others. The oldest sibling, now legally an adult, carried a particularly heavy burden, having spent years trying to protect her younger brothers and sisters. Despite these challenges, the children showed remarkable strength. Their therapists noted that while the abuse had shaped their past, it did not define their future. They were determined to heal. Not all of the children were placed together after the trial. Some were taken in by foster families, while others were placed in therapeutic care settings designed for children who had experienced severe trauma. The oldest sibling, now 18, was working toward independence, receiving counseling and support as she navigated life outside the environment of abuse. One of the younger children was adopted by a loving family, who later shared that the child was adjusting well, slowly learning what it meant to feel safe and cared for. Others remained in foster care, receiving continued therapy and support. For the first time in years, these children were experiencing a normal childhood, one without fear, hunger, or punishment. They could go to school, make friends, and dream about the future without the shadow of Whitefeather and Lantz looming over them. During the trial, some of the children had bravely shared their pain and anger toward their abusers. But in the months after the sentencing, their focus shifted to rebuilding their lives. One of the children, reflecting on their journey, wrote in a statement shared by their advocate. "I am learning what love really is. I know now that I didn't deserve what happened to me. I will make a good life for myself." Another child, still young but wise beyond their years, simply said, "I don't have to be scared anymore." Their words spoke to a powerful truth: they had survived. While the pain of their past would never fully disappear, they were finally given a chance at a future free from suffering. The case of Jeanne Whitefeather and Donald Lantz is more than just a horrifying story of abuse, it is a wake-up call. It exposed the vulnerabilities in the child welfare system, the dangers of unchecked authority in isolated environments, and the devastating impact of long-term psychological and physical abuse. The tragic experiences of these 5 children highlight the importance of vigilance, intervention, and accountability. For years, they suffered in silence, hidden away on remote properties, forced to endure unimaginable cruelty. It was only through the courage of neighbors who spoke up, the determination of law enforcement, and the persistence of prosecutors that justice was finally served. But how many other children are out there, enduring similar nightmares? This case is a reminder that child abuse does not always look the way we expect. It is not always visible, and it does not always happen behind locked doors in distant places. Sometimes, it happens in homes that seem normal from the outside, hidden behind the guise of strict parenting or disciplinary measures. That is why it is crucial to pay attention to warning signs and take action when something feels wrong. To ensure that tragedies like this do not happen again, society must take active steps to protect vulnerable children. This includes strengthening child welfare systems. Adoption agencies and child protective services must implement more rigorous follow-ups with adoptive families, especially those living in isolated areas. Encouraging mandatory reporting. Teachers, healthcare workers, and community members should be trained to recognize signs of abuse and required to report any suspicions. Supporting survivors. The trauma of abuse lasts long after the abusers are gone. Survivors need long-term counseling, safe homes, and financial support to rebuild their lives. Raising awareness. communities must speak openly about child abuse and forced labor, breaking the cycle of silence that allows such crimes to continue. If you ever suspect that a child is being abused, do not ignore it. A single phone call to Child Protective Services or law enforcement can save a life. If you are unsure, talk to professionals who can investigate further. It is always better to report and be wrong than to stay silent and allow suffering to continue. For the 5 children who endured years of torture at the hands of Whitefeather and Lantz, justice has been served. They are free, healing, and moving forward. But countless other children are still waiting for someone to notice, to care, and to intervene. Let this case be a lesson, not just in horror, but in hope. A reminder that when we pay attention, when we take action, and when we fight for justice, lives can be saved. And that is something we must never forget.
If you enjoy deep dives into true crime, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Until next time, friends!